All right, and here we are live. Thank you for joining us today. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and our Lord Jesus Christ, wherever you're watching from. I wish and hope you are well. And we have a great discussion ahead today with a great scholarly guest. It's such a great topic. It's something that I take great interest in, particularly when it comes to this study of ancient texts. And that is why I invited the guest to talk about this and explore such questions. Why do we study ancient texts? What's it with it that so special with the study of the ancient texts or ancient texts per se, and particularly talking about the Bible? Today, when we read the Bible and we open the Bible today, it's a fundamentally a text that has, I would say, traveled across thousands of years. It's been copied by hand, it's been translated into different languages, it's been preserved in many ancient manuscripts. And every time something comes up, we are fascinated, we're intrigued how it helps us to understand the Bible we have today and the personal copies that we have today. It's not only studied by, I would say, people who believe in the text more than what it says, faith, but also those who don't believe in it, right? Both the Jewish and the Christian scholars and those who are not within the faith as well. So it's always fascinating. It's a very interesting topic to talk about the study of the ancient texts, and we are very honored. I'm very honored and welcome Professor Dr. Greg Lanier with us today. And just before I bring you up to discuss the topic with us today, I would like to give him a proper introduction. So our guest today is Dr. Greg Lanier, Professor of New Testament at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, where he has served on the faculty since 2016. He teaches courses in New Testament exegesis and interpretation, biblical Greek and the Septuagint, textual criticism, and preaching. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Lanier serves part time as an associate pastor at River Oaks Church and is ordained in the Presbyterian Church in America. He completed his doctorate in Cambridge, England, and previously studied at RTS Charlotte. Before entering pastoral and academic ministry, Dr. Lanier worked in several professional fields, including management consulting and private equity investing. His journey from the business world into theological scholarship gives him a distinctive ability to communicate complex ideas with both clarity and practical insight. His research interests include the Synoptic Gospels, the formation and transmission of the biblical canon, textual criticism, the use of the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Pauline epistles, and especially the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Dr. Lanier is the director of the Institute for the Study of the Ancient Texts. Dr. Lanier also serves as the co-chair of the Septuagint Studies Program Group of the Evangelical Theological Society, sits on the editorial board of Themelios, and hosts Daily Dose of Septuagint, a resource designed to help students and scholars engage regularly with the Greek Old Testament. So without further ado, it's a great privilege and honor to welcome Dr. Greg Lanier with us.
Thanks for having me. Good to
Dr.
be here.
Greg, thank you. I hope I covered
Oh, yeah, that
as
was a
much
mouthful.
as
Yeah.
that was mouthful, but
Father of
uh,
3 girls and husband of one wife. So that's all. That's all I would add. But yeah,
yes.
appreciate the
Oh,
intro.
yes. I missed that. I yes.
That's all good. It's all good.
Right. And if I were to cover all the list of your writings and also the contributions, time would not suffice. But but I would
Thank
say from the bottom of my heart, it's really a great privilege and a blessing to have you here. And thank you so much for responding the invitation to talk with us today.
you. Yeah, well, appreciate the invitation. Appreciate the work you're doing. So happy to be
Thank
here.
you. Thank you. So, just as an icebreaker, did you want to add anything on top of what I said? Perhaps perhaps with what you are currently doing at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient Text, perhaps will be a good icebreaker to talk about
Sure.
your
Yeah. So
role.
this is a new initiative, somewhat new. It's a privately funded, some very generous donors to make this possible. Who kind of bought into the vision. There's basically three things the Institute does. First, we have student fellowships for RTS students who want to go deeper in these kinds of fields. So they've done the sort of basic biblical languages, Hebrew, Greek, etc., but they want to do more with more advanced languages. So this could be cuneiform, Ugaritic, more Septuagint, Aramaic, whatever. And they want to sort of have mentorship for more advanced research. And so
Mhm.
they join as fellows. There's a stipend that helps them. They're doing different projects with this. So that's kind of just getting, we just had our first 3 fellows join. And so we're kind of in the early days of that. Second is supporting research in various capacities. So that includes visiting lectures, conferences. So our first conference will be next June. It's actually a partnership with Daily Dose. So that we'll be having a big conference here in Orlando. And then third is public engagement. So that includes, for instance, the YouTube channel that we're doing, which has interviews like this sort of. It has manuscript studies, etc., but also kind of getting around to local schools, churches, doing workshops, seminars, how we got the Bible. I have like a lot of papyrus from Egypt that we can show off, and people can get a feel for what that looked like. We take, have a handful of facsimiles like Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and so forth, papyri, that give folks a tactile experience of ancient manuscripts, which I've found, especially for, like, I do a regular class in my kids' school. They're 9th graders. And I think touching ancient Bibles, of course, these are copies of them. I think that really brings that world alive. So public engagement is a part of it as well, getting out to lay people, churches, schools, campus ministries on university campuses. So those are kind of the 3 kind of pieces of what the Institute does. So still in the early days, trying to figure out what
Mhm.
exactly it is, because we just launched it basically 3 or 4 months ago. So it's still pretty early.
Yeah, it just appeared on my feed, and then I thought I think it's a great effort and also initiative, and I noticed that it's picking up and people really liking it because not only the way it's being presented, it's I would say relatable to lay people like many of us. It's not, I wouldn't say it's not scholarly, but also under scholarly. It's somewhat been between, and
Right.
essentially you're communicating the message. So that's really a great initiative. And thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I was
And
surprised. I did a video on the recent decipherment of the Herculaneum scrolls that were
mhm.
buried by Vesuvius. And I haven't checked lately, but it's been viewed like 20,000 times or something kind of outrageous. I'm like, all right, I guess there's an appetite for this kind of stuff. Some of them, don't, but I thought, I was like, okay, I'm scratching some sort of itch here that there's not really anyone
Yes.
doing this kind of thing, because we're sitting there reading it from the manuscripts and that kind of stuff, which is a small audience, but hopefully it's beneficial to people, and it fits with the broader, set of interests that I have. So it's been fun.
Yeah, it's like a kind of a double-edged sword because you're kind of entering into where people are not comfortable talking about this, but at the same time, there's a segment who likes stuff. Like if it's strange, if it's weird, if it's related to the Bible, the world that the Bible was actually, written across these different geographical locations and the contemporary manuscript or writings, it's really fascinating. It really brings you back to that world. So I'm one of them. So
Good. Yeah.
it's really a niche market, and it's a small, I would say, small group that you're. But I hope people. I think people are, with the help of the internet, people are increasingly getting interested into this.
Yeah.
So then the question would be, is then you particularly, because one of the things that I come across in the internet, perhaps it's my ignorance, right? But it seems to be very small number of scholars, at least from the particular tradition we're talking about, Reformed tradition, or a Protestant world, have take great interest in the study of the ancient text. So perhaps you could share with us what really motivated you, inspired to go into this particular area, into the study of the ancient texts.
That's a good question, and I do think our tribe, if you will, is growing in the broadly Protestant and Reform world. Trying to
Right.
figure out how did I get interested. I was, you mentioned in the intro, I was a business person, so this is in a lot of respects my second career. I'm a
Hmm.
late bloomer in that. I didn't grow up studying classics. I was a computer science major in undergrad, so this is all a bit new to me.
Hmm.
Still, I mean, I'm kind of a decade into it. I'm guessing I caught the bug probably when I was in seminary, and I was mentored most readily by Michael Kruger, who was at the time the president of RTS Charlotte, where I attended, and he was interested in this stuff. Of course, that was right when he was writing his books on canon,
Hmm.
which justly made him kind of a well-known figure in that conversation. But his original PhD was actually on a particular manuscript, namely Pioxyrhynchus 840, which is an apocryphal kind of gospel fragment. And so I'm guessing I sort of caught the bug from him. We didn't do a lot with manuscripts when I was at seminary, but that world is probably something that I was exposed to then, as far as I can remember. Then when I was at Cambridge, nice Cambridge hat, by the way, in the background.
Yeah, I was there for 2 years for a general management program. It's a
Okay,
non-credit program.
nice.
Yeah.
So even though my thesis, so I didn't do a PhD in textual criticism. It was
Right.
more a side hustle for me. But when I was doing my thesis on Luke's gospel, specifically his use of the Old Testament, so that's the main thing my thesis was on under Simon Gathercole there at Cambridge. There was an issue in one of the chapters that I was working on related to the parable of the wicked tenants, or the parable of the vineyard, the tenants in the vineyard, depending on how you want to call it. That was a textual variant, not so much in Luke's version, but in Matthew's version. And so I was like, I got to deal with that. So I started looking into it. And a big part of it was Papyrus 104, which is arguably, depending on who you ask, either P52 is the oldest that we have of the New Testament, or P104. There's been a lot of debate about whether we should recalibrate our dating of P52. Either way. Now, Papyrus 104 is housed at the Bodleian Library, specifically the Sackler Library at the Bodleian. And so I was like, well, that's just down the road, hypothetically. It's a complicated train ride. It's like, well, I might just go check this thing out. So I had to get permission and so forth, but spent essentially a whole day in that library with what is potentially the oldest New Testament manuscript that we have. It's just like, I mean, it's in glass, but I didn't like touch it or anything. But with a microscope, and just kind of chilling out with it for the whole day. And probably that was the second wave of, and I was still learning how to do all of this, of course, back then. I ended up writing a journal article on it that got published. So that was kind of the probably my first like hands-on, wow, this is really fun. And for whatever reason, I enjoyed it. Not everyone does. A lot of folks stay away from manuscripts. It's hard to read them, all that kind of stuff. You might know Greek well, but you don't know how to read Vaticanus or what have you. But I think for me, this is really fun. And it's just grown since then, right? It's like, I find it to be fascinating. It's a challenge. I think they're beautiful. I think the history and the way they were passed on is intrinsically interesting. But then when you overlay that on the questions of reliability of the New Testament, how we got the canon, all those kinds of questions that I've also done work in, the manuscripts are a very important part of that conversation. And so the more people we have that are competent to engage with them in a serious way, not in a kind of pop culture way, I think the better. And so it became a professional interest in due course. So textual criticism and manuscript studies, not really, I don't know if it's necessarily my main hat. It's one of a few main hats, but I find it to be very energizing and exciting. So, and my hope is when folks, like a lot of lay people, when they start talking about manuscripts, they tend to glaze over because it's just complicated and esoteric. But I think if you teach it well,
Right.
even for folks who don't know Greek or don't know it well, I think it can be quite engaging because, as you mentioned, it is historically it's interesting. I think there's a rise of interest in that kind of thing. So anyway, that's kind of how I got into it.
Right. Because primarily we are dealing with data. I don't speak Greek or Hebrew, but it's just the data that fascinates. It's just intrigues you, just brings you into a different whole world. And I agree that it takes a certain mind to an interest. You just have to have that in you to be continually persuaded to study this particular. Dr. Greg, if you don't mind, just one question from the chat is that what is the dating of this manuscript? I assume it's referring to the P104.
Yeah, P104 is by pretty wide consensus dated to the latter half of the 2nd century, maybe early 3rd, but I think pretty much everybody would say call it 175 to 200. P52 is
Mm,
basically, now the P52 is the more famous one because for the longest time it's been hailed as the oldest. It's not until maybe the past 10 years that certain scholars have, based on the paleography and other factors, have said maybe it's a little bit later. But
right.
it's kind of in the same ballpark, call it 175 to 225. But P104, there's not really much debate about it. That it's definitely quite early. So one of the things that's cool for me, I was like, okay, it's just a little fragment, it's a piece of Matthew. Presumably, it's from a codex that had the whole thing. It is a codex; it's front and back. But what I think really impacted me in that moment, as I was just sitting there with it by myself in a library with a microscope, is I was like, wow, this was some church's Bible from, and it could have been copied, let's say it's 175, whatever,
Right.
from like almost 1800. Like that was crazy. And in that moment, it's like, wow, that's really cool that I'm looking
Mm,
at the very tattered remnant of, we don't know exactly where it's from, presumably Egypt, some church's Bible that people
right.
read either personally or liturgically. It's like, that's pretty cool. You don't get that kind of experience often. So now I think that was also a part of it. It's like, wow, this is a really neat portal back to the past. So, but yeah, it's going
Yes.
to be 175 to 225, but I lean towards latter part of the second century.
Right. It just helps you to connect the root as a Christian. It just helps you to the ancient past.
Right.
As I said, it's sometimes it's more spiritual when I sit here and sometimes read these things. But then the question continues: why do scholars, like, we have the Bibles today here already? Like, it's
Mhm.
almost like, translations and versions and study Bibles and different versions of it. So why do scholars and scholars like you continue to study the manuscripts even after having the completed the Bible?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's a handful of reasons. So first, one reason is that we're still making new discoveries, not
Mm,
nearly as often as we were in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That was a big boom of people finding manuscripts, both large ones and fragments. And so we're not necessarily in that era where every day there's something new that's found in some trash heap in Egypt. So we're not so much in that era, but we still have new ones. Every year, a couple New Testament papyri are discovered. Quite famously was the manuscript of Mark, Papyrus 137, that for a long time folks thought it was being billed as the first century manuscript. Turns out it wasn't, but that made the news. I think we're up to maybe 142 or 143 papyri, so we still have some. Most of them don't necessarily change our understanding of the text, but
mm,
as artifacts, they are quite significant. So we still have work that's being done. People are still making trips to, Greece or Egypt, trying to find new manuscripts. So that will continue. We're kind of in the long tail of discoveries, but either way, that's important. I would say second, work is still ongoing, trying to perfect the Greek text. We have a very stable, we have a very, very stable text. We have a high degree of confidence in the text that we have. And that includes both those who are more Textus Receptus or Byzantine textual proponents, but also folks like me who are more reasoned eclectics who have a different way of approaching this and
mm,
gravitate more towards like the Nestle Aland UBS or Tyndale House tradition. And on
right.
the other side, we have high confidence of a very stable text that's remarkably unified across the board. That being said, there's still work to be done. There are still places where the more evidence you get, you think, well, maybe the correct reading is this, or maybe the correct reading is that. And so that work is still being done. So the teams that are based mostly in Germany, but a bit in England, some Americans are involved that are doing the ongoing work. Every couple years, there's new editions of, most recently, the Book of Revelation. Prior to that, Gospel of Mark. Prior to that, Book of Acts and the Catholic letters, where they made changes to the sort of standard critical text that your English Bibles and so forth that they use. Now, these are not, it's like 1%, if not less than 1%. Like it's considerably less than 1%, but still relevant, still important, still
Right.
impacts. What is the NIV committee going to do the next time around? So I'll give you an example. The most recent critical Greek New Testament, the United Bible Society's 6th edition, just came out a couple months ago. I did a video on that for the Institute. And they made the decision to change the way they're presenting the order of the books. It's not the traditional order that, at least in English Bibles, has prevailed in North America for a long time. It's going back closer to what we see in most of the ancient manuscripts. Now, some of the other editions have already done that, but this is a big deal. And the question that many of us are grappling with is, our English Bible committees, is the next version of the NIV or the CSB or whatever, are they going to do the same thing and go Gospels, Acts, general epistles, Paul with Hebrews included, and then Revelation? That's an interesting question. So, the job's not done. We're still making, improvements to the text. Lastly, I'll mention, in terms of manuscripts, within the guild of textual criticism, probably the biggest change or the biggest transition that's happened over the past 5-10 years is a move from being hyper-focused on the text and the wording, which is, I think, what you were talking about, to now a very heightened interest in kind of all the other stuff around it. So this would be what we call paratext, titles, things in the margins, how the codex was put together, illustrations, comments at the end that are not part of the text, so to speak, line counts, all kinds of stuff like that. And so those kinds of features have really generated a lot of interest, because it used to not be the focus, because we were just only focused on what does the text of Romans say, or whatever.
Right.
But now there's a lot of interest, and I find it to be very, very fascinating. Like, what were scribes doing? What are their kind of footnotes and so forth? So there's a whole world. In fact, I'm going to be working on a book in this direction, introducing lay people to what is that world kind of around the text itself. Because if you look at it, the modern study Bible, we have the same kinds of stuff. We have introductions, we have titles, we have verse numbers, chapter numbers, footnotes.
Yes.
That are not part of the text, like John 16. And so I think there's a whole new wave of a lot of work that's being done in that area. So, and I find it to be quite interesting, because it's another way of getting back to history. Like, what were they interested in? What were scribes? What were readers? What were preachers doing to their Bibles, marking them up and annotating them? So it's really, really quite interesting. So that's a whole new, it's not new, but there's a whole lot more interest in that kind of thing. So those are the kind of things that are still happening. There's still a lot of work to be done. So it's by no means a dead field. In fact, I would say, kind of similar to Septuagint studies, we're kind of in maybe a renaissance of text critical studies. I think there's a lot more students that are interested, that are going into it. You have some of the folks that are well known around the world, like your Wesley Huffs and so forth, that have, on the one side, you also have your Bart Ehrmans on the other side. Either way, their types of videos and publications have put this kind of stuff on the forefront of people's minds. So I find more lay people asking me these kinds of questions, like, what do you think about the long ending of Mark or whatever, than 10 years ago. So it's definitely trickled down to the pew. Even though we have very good English translations and other translations, we're still, every translation goes through updates, and people have to provide the data for that. So
what I've noticed is that with the not only growth of interest, but also the study is being taken into the specific scope of the subject matter, or the subject matter in general, is that there's increasing number of, or amount of materials that's being put out there that's accessible. When I mean accessible, it's from the comprehensional level. The books that you have put out and also you have contributed, I could read it and immediately communicate the idea of it. But I would say, like, at least I do not know, perhaps I'm new to this, so I'm the contemporary materials are accessible to me. But I would say perhaps 50 years ago it wouldn't have been the same, because I think the language and also people's interest. But on top of that is that the terminology and the phrases, and also how the explanation works behind it, very much important, and has helped us to really get into this, even at the beginner level. So I really appreciate what you are doing at the Institute, and also the others which you mentioned, like Wesley Huff and the likes, right? There's a particular... go ahead.
20 or 30 years ago, your average pastor probably wasn't super interested in these topics. They might have learned it in seminary, but it was like an hour in a lecture and they immediately forgot. And text criticism, Septuagint stuff, all those kinds of things were mostly academic elites at major universities, and they
Mm.
don't tend to have an interest in or a capacity to communicate to the pew. But I think what
Right.
you've seen, I mean, it includes Mike Kruger, but it includes Chuck Hill, my former colleague, even like your F.F. Bruce from a prior generation. But today, Peter Williams at Tyndale House, Dirk Yonkin with his Crossway book. You have a variety of scholars who actually wear two hats, similar to
Mm.
me. So that they have a foot in the academic world, but they also have some church role as well. And I
Right.
think that type of scholar is more interested in bridging the gap, whereas a
Precisely.
University of Tübingen prof who has a research position, they don't really
Right.
care to write the TGC, Gospel Coalition, or Crossway
Correct.
book. I think you just have more folks who have the training, but also the interest to communicate it to a lay audience because we believe that it's important. Or Peter
Yes.
Gurley is another example, a buddy of mine from Cambridge. He's very good at that as well with the Text and Canon Institute and John Mead. So, yeah, maybe you have a more of a younger generation that we've been trained by very good scholars, Dan Wallace or whomever, and we have a desire to say, all right, how do we convey this to our people that we're shepherding, but still be good scholars? To do
Yes.
both is a challenge, and so, but I think you have a lot of, especially younger scholars who are interested in that. So I do think there has
Yes.
been that's why I say there's a bit of a renaissance in that, where if you do this long enough and you have YouTube videos and blog posts
Mm.
that put this out there, people start to develop the vocabulary and they realize, oh,
Right.
this does matter. This isn't just for the nerds. Like this actually matters. So, like in fact,
Yes.
this Sunday, I'm starting a whole long Sunday school series at my church. I'm gonna be getting into this. So I'm already, thinking through, okay, how do I make this relevant to our teenagers, to our adults who don't know Greek, don't know Hebrew? It's on me to make it, like, I think it's intrinsically compelling, but what's incumbent on me is how do I communicate that in a way that isn't going to put everyone to sleep. So I'll let you know
Yeah.
on Monday how it goes.
Sure. It's just, I think essentially it really communicates like what's the to know your faith. I think that really helps uh, grow someone to grow in the faith by knowing your ancient roots and also the
Right.
history of what you're reading fundamentally, right? And you mentioned just a quick, briefly, you mentioned two locations, Greece and Egypt. I was wondering why these two particular locations or somewhere there's where we find a lot of manuscript. Is that what's the reasoning behind it? Not elsewhere, but this particular Egypt, Alexandria, or Greece. Any particular reasoning behind this?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of Egypt, that one is mostly, but not exclusively, a function of climate.
Okay.
Where when you think about what ancient manuscripts are copied on, in terms of first papyrus was the kind of go-to technology, if you will, the paper. It's not wood; it's reeds from the Nile River. Um, they're not super durable, and so when you have a very arid climate, things tend to survive better when they're made of this kind of organic material. Plus, you have
Right.
a very strong church in Egypt. Alexandria was one of the key centers of early Christianity and actually Judaism. So you have a lot of manuscripts from the Jewish world as well that are in
Mm.
that area. So part of that is climate. Part of that is academically and religiously, Egypt was a hotspot. It was a big deal. You have relatively fewer of them from the Judean area, and that again is
Okay.
largely related to both climate. Things don't survive as well there because back then, at least, it was much more rainy, for lack of a better term.
Mm.
Things don't survive as well, but you also have a fair amount of conflict happening there. And so when you have wars breaking out like
Right.
all the time, including modern day, things don't tend to survive. But you do have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so but
Right.
they're kind of a special case where they were in isolation, stored in jars in these caves. That's why they survive. But
Right.
you're not walking around Jerusalem in the ancient landfill finding them. They just didn't survive. Kind of a different set of reasons in Greece. It's mostly related to the strength of the church there, especially once you're sort of pivoting into the Eastern Church. But you
Mm.
also have a lot of monasteries that are, especially in remote locations, that like Mount
Right.
Athos, have you, that are doing a lot of copying, and so just almost strength in numbers of workforce. You have a lot in the Greek Isles. Now they're not necessarily old.
Right.
Most of the old ones are going to be from Egypt, but there's going to be a lot of them when it comes to Greece. Constantinople is
Yes.
another place where you have some concentration. Kind of beyond that, it's going to be a bit more hit or miss, especially the farther back you go. All roads
Mm.
kind of ultimately lead back to Egypt. So, I mean, providentially, that's actually an important point is that when you look at the manuscript record that we have, it's lumpy. It's not like
Right.
we have tens of thousands of manuscripts from everywhere. It just that historically artifacts don't work that way. It's often random is the wrong word as a believer in providence, but in terms of likelihood of survival, it's far more circumstantial than folks realize because there's just a lot of factors that lead
Yes.
to things. For 2,000 years, that's a long time for things
True.
to survive, and so it's not like you have an even distribution across the entire, Roman Empire, so to speak. So,
True.
but yeah,
I myself been to several islands in Greece, for example. I think one of the islands was Agina. It could be Hydros or Poros, one of the three islands. They had a they had a monastery at the top of the hill, and that's one of the that's one of the locations where they can also spot the enemy. So during the Turkish invasion, it was told that there was some monasteries at the lower level, close to the ground. They would actually grab the scrolls and run it to the top and lock themselves underneath the monasteries. It's just amazing um, work, and to see the history that goes behind, particularly spot on, and it really makes sense. The climate really contributes to the
yeah,
preservation, at least from
right,
the longest period. Not only the material, right, but also the climate really helps to
right.
work hand in hand with the material that's being written down on.
And
Um,
even then, the vast majority that did happen to survive, the farther back
right.
you go, they're little pieces of it, right? It's not the whole thing.
Mm,
Yeah. Worms
yes.
exist and bugs and fire, and there's
Yes.
so many things that are conspiring against the survival of,
And
essentially
that
a
that's
written surface that is made of not very durable, cheap reed
true.
from the Nile River. So,
And that is why you brought up this providence, and it's not just random. So we thank God for everything that He has done to protect and preserve this to what
right.
we have today. I like one of the series that you is actually the shots on the RTS Institute for the Study of the Ancient Text. That's the scribal practices. I would, I would encourage the audience to just visit the RTS Institute for the Study of Ancient Texts and just watch these shots. You'll be amazed. It'll be like eye opener. You're like, what on earth? How's that even, come across the minds of that particular time, right? So it's amazing. So perhaps if you could, if you don't mind, perhaps share with us two or three scribal practices that we may not even thought about it in
Sure, yeah.
particular, whatever is the Old Testament or the New Testament
Yeah, and I'm
sense.
gonna try to put them together in a full video. I think that those are just a series of shorts. I was trying my hand at shorts. I'm kinda new to this YouTube game, so
Okay.
trying out some different things. So when we mean scribal practices, what that means is in addition to simply copying the letters of the text, which itself that's a big achievement, that's hard to do.
Mm,
Um, they did certain things in effect to package it, and we do the same thing today, right? When we're writing a document, let's just use English as what I know best. We tab in, at least in English, to start a new paragraph. We use footnotes for certain things, so that we might use a header that's bold and blue or something like that. And so we often think that that kind of markup, which is almost always aimed at helping the reader process the information. Because if you just have a sea of text, like a big notepad file of just words, it's hard to know where to go and what you're dealing with. It's hard to read. And so scribes, just like we do today, they use remarkably similar approaches to mark up the text itself. And this includes the Bible, but they're not the ones who are necessarily pioneering it because you see it with the Iliad and the Odyssey and so forth as well. And so some of my favorites, one of the really important ones is the use of titles. And so the vast majority of the manuscripts that we have where a portion of Romans or Matthew or James that could have had a title, namely the first page, where that has survived, again, because of climate and so forth, you don't always have that. We almost always have titles. So the Gospels are according to Matthew or according to Luke. The Pauline epistles, it's going to be to the Romans or to the Ephesians or something along those lines. And so the titles, even though they may not have been written into the text by Paul under inspiration, as an example, we don't have any, it's hard to know whether he would have included a title in his actual letter. They go back very early because they're uniform across the manuscripts. You don't ever have a Gospel of Luke that somebody accidentally called the Gospel of Barnabas or something like that. Or you don't have misnamed letters of Paul. So they go back very early, and sometimes you'll see them on a running header. So like Codex Vaticanus will have them kind of on every page just to remind you where you are. And so I think the titles are very, very fascinating because we do the same. They're navigational aids. They tell us something about the writing. And like for the Gospels, for instance, as soon as you have two of them, you kind of need a title. Like if you just have one of them, like, well, it's the Gospel. Fair enough. But as soon as you get the second one, you're like, oh, we got to distinguish these two. So at least from that point, you have a very early use of gospel titles and so on. So they tell us a lot about reception history. They also tell us a lot about you're trying to help readers navigate where they are. So titles are interesting. There's a whole boatload of, sorry, that's an American idiom. There's a whole lot of things that scribes do to indicate a new paragraph. Now, you'll often hear a pastor say, oh, the paragraph break or the subheader or the chapter number is not original or not inspired. And in one sense, that's true. But you also have presumably an early tradition of breaking up the text into its logical units, because that's just good communication. You have that in a lot of ancient manuscripts. And so there are a couple of things they might do. They would use basically outdenting. We call it ekthesis. So usually in English, at least, you indent a new paragraph. But in Greek manuscripts, you don't indent, you outdent. You put it into the left margin, like one or two letters. So it sort of jabs out to the left, but you can visually see the new paragraph. You can also do a little overline that's called a paragraphos marking. That's another way to indicate it. Sometimes you'll have sort of punctuation that will tell you, oh, this is the end of the paragraph. Go to the, here's the next paragraph. It starts on the next line. Sometimes you might have an enlarged letter. So Codex Alexandrinus, very famous manuscript, has these big letters that indicate a new paragraph. And then sometimes you have numbers. So they'll actually number the paragraphs. So it's essentially a rudimentary form of doing chapter numbers.
Wow.
Like the standard chapter numbers that we use come in the 1500s, but the earlier versions of them, which sometimes line up with ours, sometimes don't, they go back very, very early. And so there was a very clear, sincere interest in segmenting the text to make it readable. So that, if you're at the church at Antioch on a Sunday morning and you're supposed to be preaching from such and such section of John, it's right there. It's not just a sea of words. So you have very early segmentation traditions. Last one I'll mention, it's one of my favorites, is how they indicate Old Testament citations. So modern translations, sometimes they'll put quotation marks, sometimes just a footnote, sometimes they'll do it in italics, sometimes they'll do bold. King James doesn't do any of these. So that's all helpful. It's like, oh, this is written in Isaiah or whatever. Sometimes you'll see a footnote that says, okay, this is from Deuteronomy 32, etc. That's not a new thing. I mean, scribes have been doing that for a long time. You even see little kind of bits and pieces of that, even in the earliest copies of Paul's writings. Papyrus 46, you have some indications that they're marking up Old Testament citations, and they're just getting that from the general scribal culture. So even before the New Testament, people are doing that if they're going to quote Homer in some sort of philosophical book, you would mark it and say this is a quoted passage. The most common thing that you'll see is the use of essentially a greater than sign. It's called a dipple, and that they're borrowing that from ancient scribes and grammarians. So you'll see this a lot in manuscripts where it's like, oh, this is Isaiah 6 or whatever, and they'll mark it in the margin so that you can see, okay, this is an Old Testament citation. And then eventually, not in the early days, but eventually you'll see scribes actually write the name of the book in the margin. This is from Genesis, or this is from the Psalms. And sometimes they'll even get it wrong, which I find to be kind of funny because sometimes I mess it up too. As they say, this is from Deuteronomy, and you're like, it's not from Deuteronomy. They just, they slipped up on that front. But they didn't have accordance, they didn't have logos. So They didn't have
All
Bible, they didn't
right.
have Google. They had no way to find it. So they did their best. They're pretty accurate on the whole. So marking up Old Testament citations, I think, is a pretty fun scribal feature as well. All of this was related to, I think, a conviction among the scribes and preachers, teachers, people using the Bibles that are being made, which are, again, are very expensive. People don't have it on their phones,
Yeah.
very hard to get access to scripture back in these days. But most of these features are oriented, and I think this is the key takeaway. They're oriented to helping people read the Bible with understanding, and I think also read it publicly.
Yeah.
Having these segmenting devices, especially in a world in which they're using scriptio continuum, which is in Greek,
Yes.
you don't have spaces, you have very limited punctuation. Marking up the text in these other ways will help you navigate to where you are. So if you're trying to read publicly from whatever Ephesians on a Sunday morning, because that's what you're going to be preaching from, these things help you navigate that. So I think it's
Right.
an indirect way of getting at that. Early Christians were using these writings in church context, but also privately. They cared about the reading experience. It's not just about the words. The words are the main thing, but the packaging matters too. Just like today, imagine trying to sell a Bible that's just Genesis 1 to Revelation with just words, like, and take out the spaces. Like, no one would buy that. That would be a terrible experience. Even though it's like, well, those are the words that are inspired. Like, well, true, but I kind of need the other stuff too to help figure out where in the world am I. Good luck finding First Chronicles if it's just a Word document with nothing but words in it. So good luck with that. So I think it's part of that culture. I think it's just fascinating, and I think helpful.
And
for
no
us.
breaks, no breaks in between.
It'd be
It's
so
just
bad.
like one long scroll.
It would be
You got to figure out West
so
Chronicles.
bad. So I'm thankful. It's I think it gives you a little bit of a window into what they were concerned about. That it wasn't just we got to copy the words.
Yes.
That's true. That's their main job. But it's like we also kind of want people to use this.
Precisely. I think that's what a lot of, I think in the modern times we take it for granted how we have received the Bible. It's just people just take it as it's given, but it has traveled not only in terms of its duration, not in terms of time in reality, but people, a lot of minds that have put in a lot of work together. I think one or two things that comes to mind is that because of the lack of paper, like we throw paper as if it's tissue today, obviously. So I think one of the things, like I think Wesley Huff brought this was, is it either Wesley Huff or another scholar brought this, is that because of the lack of space, like in terms of the papyrus or papyri, they used to make write the name of our Lord in short form. Is that correct? Is it how, because they will shorten it? Is it? Am I saying it correctly?
Yes. So those are called nomina sacras, the sacred names, and they are abbreviations for a variety of words like Jesus, Christ, Lord, God. Whether they did that to save space, I don't necessarily buy that, because you don't save that much space. There are other reasons why they might have used those, but your broader point is correct. Papyrus was relatively cheap, but not that cheap. It's not like you're going to go buy a 500-page, ream of white paper, really nice paper that you can go get easily here for $3. That wasn't the case. And parchment from animal skin, I mean, that was very expensive. So they would often reuse pages, or they're going to use pottery or what scraps, whatever they can have, especially if you're on the lower income side of things. So I think we do underestimate how relevant that is. That it was expensive to make a Bible. You might have one Bible in your entire town for one church, right? It's not like everybody has. I mean, I got like 50 Bibles probably. I don't need that many, but I have them. People give them to me all the time. And that's such a luxury. And so I think that does probably skew how we view the ancient world. We just think, Paul probably just has his own, NIV study Bible. I'm like, no. You got to go to the synagogue to find the scrolls when you roll into Corinth or wherever you are. So
the cross reference as well, because we, at times people in discussions like, oh, I remember this is where it is. Well, yeah, because it's given in your study Bible, it helps you. Like these scholars have put, like basically they're guiding you where to cross reference it, right? But not in the ancient world.
Yeah, I mean, so if I can add a bonus scribal feature, on
Right.
that point, we kind of take it for granted when you're reading Matthew,
Mm-hmm.
and let's say it's the parable of the sower.
Okay.
You're like, okay, I know this is probably found in other gospels because it sounds familiar. And that would be
Mm.
true. It's in Mark and Luke and Gospel of Thomas. And you have 50 different ways to figure out where that is, right? Because you can Google it. You probably have it in your footnotes. You can just tap on it on your phone and it'll like open up the other passage. None of that existed 1800 years ago. And the first kind of church fathers to work on this issue of like, okay, we know they're the same passage. We got to figure out a way to help people with that. The first one to really do that, well, there's a couple. You have Justin Martyr's student, Tatian, who tries to just smash them all together. You got Ammonius, who comes up with a numbering system that's keyed to Matthew, and he tries to sort it out. But really the one who figured it out was Eusebius, where he says, all right, we're going to number all the passages in the margin. So it's a scribal feature. He puts numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Every story in Matthew, every story in Mark, Luke, and John, they all have a numbering system. And then, I mean, it would have been awesome if he had, Microsoft Excel, which would be, because essentially what he does, he creates data tables that
Right.
say, all right, number 17 in Matthew lines up with I'm just making this up. Don't quote me on this. 17 in Matthew lines up with 33 in Mark or whatever it is. And he'll put tables at the beginning that help you navigate. So when you see 17 in Matthew, you can go to his table, like, oh, I need to go look for number whatever in Mark, and I can navigate to it. These are called the Eusebian canon tables. Very, very fascinating, very popular. Augustine used them and so forth. So that's another scribal feature that you'll see in a lot of manuscripts, usually very decorated, just as an aid. And we take that stuff for granted. And the funny thing is Eusebius was really accurate. Like essentially the ones that
Mm.
we have today, whenever you say, okay, in Luke, this chat, this corresponds to the parallel and whatever, they're mostly what Eusebius did, 1500 years ago. So it's pretty sweet. Those are cool too.
Yes. And this is why I like historical theology, and thank you for what you're doing as well, because if I could say it, if I'm saying it accurately, if I'm wrong, you can correct me. Historical theology, in terms of the study of the biblical manuscript, is just amazing. Like, some fun fact today, as you mentioned, we have been doing this from ancient times, right?
Right.
So thank you. I'd like to give additional thanks for writing this book.
All right.
Get this
We'll
book
give it
from
over
the
to Septuagint.
audience.
Yeah.
The Septuagint, what is it, what it is, and why it matters, from our guest, Dr. Greg R. Lanier, and also, I think, co-authored by William A. Ross.
Yeah. He's a
The
colleague of
reason
mine at a different RTS.
okay, right. The reason I bought this book is because there's so many. There's like, the first thing that came to my mind was like, should I take the this Oxford handbook for the Septuagint? That's like $200.
And yeah,
What
I
should
have it
I?
right here. It's enormous. Yeah.
Oh wow! It's like,
I
okay,
have it.
I'm not.
It's right here. Well, it's under anyway. It's a very large volume. Yes.
Yes, and I thought myself, do I need it? Then I was asking Google overview for a beginner. Then your book came up. So generally speaking, the reason being is that because I think even I'm willing to say, because of my tradition or the bias that we have to particular family text, right, of tradition, textual tradition. Generally speaking, some Christians seems to have this negative perception about Septuagint, and then it's like the moment Septuagint comes in, it's like, oh, you guys are heretic. You guys don't have you guys have a different Bible. And then reading this book, it's a fairly very easy to read. I'm almost finishing it, like in the span of 3 weeks. I religiously read this just for the interview. Gonna quote some of it as well. So in your book, you say that students of the Bible need to know that the Greek Old Testament plays a major role in restoring the Hebrew text, where our traditional manuscripts in the Masoretic tradition are less than pristine. Please shed some light on this, because this seems to me, when I read this, I'm with you as well. I'm eclectic. I think it naturally came to me because the way I see it. But that kind of surprised me as well. Perhaps that took away a lot of assumption. So help us to talk about this when you said this.
Yeah, sure. So it is a slightly contentious point, at least in certain circles. So to unpack what we're talking about, virtually, essentially every modern translation of the Old Testament will draw on the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
The exception will be the Orthodox churches. They will be using only the Septuagint. So everything, everyone goes back to the Hebrew, and I am pro Hebrew as well. I believe the scriptures of the Old Covenant were inspired in Hebrew with a bit of Aramaic. And I think the best representative of that tradition is the Masoretic text. Call it started 400s, 500s AD, but the manuscript that everyone uses is from like 1009 AD, Codex, the Leningrad Codex. Okay, so that's background. So I am not at all anti-Masoretic text. The Masoretic text, I think, is exceptionally good, very well preserved, and gives us exceedingly good access to what God inspired Moses and Isaiah, and Nahum, and so forth to write. So that's first thing I'll mention. That being said, even the Masoretes, these rabbis, these rabbinic scholars of a particular school, even they admitted that over the, call it 2,000-year time frame, building up to when they're doing their work from the time of Moses, that it hasn't been preserved through this very manual process. They didn't have Apple iCloud, they didn't have Google Drive, they didn't have OneDrive. That scribes did on occasion have a slip of the pen. And so what they do in the margins is indicate situations where that might be true, where they try to preserve a different set of consonants or what have you. So even the Masoretes, I think, would agree with our premise. All right, so that's the presupposition, is that what you have when you look at even the Masoretic manuscripts that we do have, including Leningrad, but also the others, you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls that are the biblical scrolls in Hebrew, you don't have 100% agreement. Now, it's not like it's 50% agreement either. Like, it's still a high degree of agreement, but there's an error, there's a margin of error, if you will. Some passages worse than others. So what we're trying to say with that quote is that the Septuagint, that is the tradition of Greek translations of the Hebrew that begin roughly in, call it 250 BC, most likely in Egypt, to go back to Egypt. Everything goes back to Egypt. That the Septuagint should have a seat at the table, because the Septuagint is a translation from the Hebrew into Greek. And what we have is a very old sort of Septuagintal access to that.
Right.
As opposed to the Masoretic tradition, which is, from an age perspective, much more recent, because the manuscripts are much sort of later. Septuagint gives us an earlier window. And so there are situations where Will and I would, and pretty much any scholar would agree, that's not sort of a hyper anti-Septuagint person, would say, yeah, there are situations where we think the Septuagint preserves better Hebrew reading, it's just been translated into Greek, than the Masoretic text. In fact, I have a journal article coming out in a few months that actually details what modern English translations do with that, which I don't think had ever been studied. So how often does ESV, New International Version, Christian Standard Version, New Revised Standard Version, those are the big four I study, but King James does it too. How often did they actually prefer the Septuagint over the Masoretic? And it's more often than you think.
Right.
So that's what we're trying to say, is that Hebrew is exceptional in the Masoretic tradition, but it's not 100% perfect. And in that slight area where it's not perfect, the Septuagint and the Latin and the Syriac and the Dead Sea Scrolls, they can help. That's all we're trying to say. Now, for some reason, it is rather controversial. So we have a whole session at the Evangelical Theological Society meeting this year. It's going to be on this very topic, because there's been a growing chorus of people. It's mostly in America. I don't think it's outside of America that much, that really don't like what I just said. They very much oppose the idea that we should ever make any changes to the Masoretic text. The irony is, Masoretes, I think, would be on our side. But it's all good. We're all part of the church. It's all good. I
Yeah.
get mad at each other about it, but there's been
I
a
think that's
growth
the
in that
true.
front.
That's what you said at the end as a conclusive statement is what actually kind of bothers me, because primarily we're dealing with data, and the data actually communicates this kind of facts. I wonder why we are so, kind of worried and quote unquote, I would say apprehensive about it, when all we are doing is basically taking the approach of study
Right.
and helping to reveal the data as much as it can help us to understand the Bible, which you already mentioned in very early of our earlier part of our conversation, that pretty much nothing is going to change essentially when talking about the essence of the
Right.
Bible, what we have today. It's more of an academic study, and
Yeah.
I assume that's going to be sort of a tension and also a pushback constantly because of the assumption, and also most of the time is the bias that we have.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
essentially on this point, this also impacts how we approach New Testament textual
mm,
criticism as well. You have folks who are like King James only,
mm,
and then you have others who are like, I mean, King James is great. I love King James, but there's other data as well. And I think there's kind of two different mentalities at play that are very much opposed, that play out in this conversation. One mentality is I need to have absolute confidence in every word of mainly my English Bible,
mhm.
or underneath that, the Hebrew and Greek, with zero doubt whatsoever. And if I
Right.
don't, then inspiration is somehow called into question, and we don't know
Mm,
what God's word says.
right.
And I think actually some critical scholars have the kind of inverse view of that. It's like, you don't know anything about what the New Testament says. Look at all the textual variants. I'm like, you don't have to draw that conclusion. The other
No.
view
Yep.
is I have very good confidence that we have reconstructed the Old and New Testament with the data at our disposal that God has seen fit to preserve for us, among the plurality of the manuscripts that He's given us, because He did not see fit to give us the original copy, the autograph. And I can sleep perfectly fine at night knowing that, yeah, there's a couple places like 1 Samuel 13:1 or whatever
Yeah.
where we're still scratching our head, but it's like, that's okay. It's gonna be fine.
Yeah.
The
True.
answer is probably out there somewhere. We just don't have full alignment on it, but it's fine. And
True.
that doesn't at all call into question the doctrine of inspiration or inerrancy. Um, so those are kind of the two different kind of worldviews almost. And I don't know. There's a lot of angst on one side of like, I've got to have absolute certainty, and if not, then something's wrong. The rest of us like, I mean, I have really, really, really good certainty. There's still some footnotes that we're debating, and that's okay. Like, we're fine. We'll find
Yeah.
out one
It's
day. We'll ask Paul, where
yeah.
was the ending of Romans? Was it verse 24 or verse 27? We'll figure it out. It's not a big deal. Like, we're okay. It's gonna be fine. Put it in
True. It
brackets
seems
if you
that
need.
the faith is actually on the words, not sort of the message that's been like, I'm just saying in a general sense, right? It almost, then it would be, then the New Testament or the Bible in general and overall, wouldn't be defensible if you take this wooden, some scholars would say it's like the Islamic view of how you view the inspired text is. You
Yeah, I mean
approaching word
that
for
is
word, word for word.
it, it does start to kind of look like that.
Yeah,
It's this very dogmatic approach, which is, I mean, people are fine. Again, they're brothers and sisters in Christ.
sure.
I don't fully understand the mentality or
Right.
the kind of angst about it, but that's where we are. So we just,
Yep.
try to do our best.
So, we kind of made a positive case. I'll end with this for the question that you answered about, in terms of how the Greek Old Testament. After reading this book, I have taken the approach of always referring to the Greek Old Testament.
Oh yeah,
The Bible Hub has the Brenton Septuagint translation, so I was like, okay, if this Old Testament verse says about it, what does the Septuagint says? A kind of commentary of what actually, I'm doing textual criticism online at the level. I find it
right,
very interesting. I did find something, for example, in John 10, if not mistaken, where it says that St. John actually quotes where he says, "In whom they have pierced," and then Septuagint actually translates, "In whom they have mocked." So
right.
I found that pretty interesting, and I really thank you for guiding. Kind of the message that you conveyed from this book is to view Septuagint as a commentary, right? The
Right.
closest
Yeah,
commentary
and
that we
in
have.
fact, I mean, your next reading assignment, if you don't mind, I'm gonna grab it. Um,
Right.
uh, you should. Sorry, there we go. You should pick up this one, which is the Authority of the Septuagint, also by edited by myself and Will
Okay.
Ross, because we get into part of this issue that we've just been discussing is how do you understand the Septuagint in relationship to the Hebrew? And so this is a collection of essays by a variety of scholars, patristics, systematic theologians, and so forth.
Wow.
And the one that you just mentioned in terms of John's, look upon the one they pierced, etc.
Right.
Whenever you look at the use of the Old Testament and the New, you basically have three scenarios that play out. And so we use these as case studies. That's one of them in the book. One option is the quoted form in Matthew or whatever in the New Testament, even though it's in Greek, obviously, it essentially matches what we have in the Hebrew if you were to backwards engineer it back in Hebrew. So that's fine.
Right.
So that's one of them. So John appears to be drawing on the Hebrew form of that Zechariah quotation because the Septuagint doesn't make any sense there.
Right.
Then you have situations where the quoted form in the New Testament lines up with the Septuagint, but it doesn't match what we have in the Masoretic text. And those are the really interesting ones. And you have, like, for instance, the Hebrews quotation of Psalm 40, a body you have prepared for me. Whereas in the Hebrew of Psalm 40, it says, like, ears you have dug for me. You've given me an open ear. So that's a very famous one. And then you have situations that basically the Septuagint and the Hebrew are the same. And so it doesn't, essentially, so it doesn't really make a difference. So those are all very interesting kind of case studies, either pro-Hebrew but not Septuagint, pro-Septuagint but definitely not the same as the Hebrew, or they're kind of interchangeable. And so we walk through all of that because the church fathers, you like history, they were really interested in this question. One of the things that pushed St. Augustine essentially from one position to the other. So he was originally all in on Septuagint because he was kind of borrowing that from Origen.
Okay.
Through his conversations with Jerome, and like Augustine was like, Hebrew, this is a bit of an overstatement, but bear with me. Augustine was like, Hebrew doesn't matter. Septuagint is the thing. Then as he's talking with Jerome over letters, and Jerome would point out situations where it's very clear that Matthew or Paul are drawing on the Hebrew and they can't be drawing on the Septuagint, then Augustine's like, okay, maybe the Hebrew is good too. So it's interesting. They're grappling with all these different situations because the depth isn't 100% one or the other. It's a bit of a mixed bag. So anyway, we talk about all this kind of stuff in the Authority of the Septuagint.
I'll get that. Yeah, I'll get that.
And it's nowhere near as expensive as the Oxford Handbook.
Oh no, I'm not. I don't think so. I don't think so. Although I take great interest on this. I've like at least close to, like, there's one particular subject matter that I have close to 10 books is on the study of biblical manuscript. F.F. Bruce, Dr. Michael Kruger, and so forth. And now I've got 3 books of yours, and we have made a positive case about the Septuagint. But let me read from you as well, page 98, where you say that to speak of the Septuagint, speaking of Septuagint as a singular coherent textual entity is simply not possible. So the earlier we made a kind of positive case, now seems to be, it's like, hey, it's not even possible to talk about Septuagint as a singular coherent textual entity. Why is that so?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think that, like, one of the first things we do in the book that is called the Septuagint is to say that there's, like, not really such a thing. We didn't pick the title, though. Crossway picked the title. We're kind of stuck with it. So Septuagint, in its original historical usage, was first only really applicable to the initial translation of the Pentateuch from the Hebrew.
Okay.
That was the original use of the word. But then, because everyone agrees, the Pentateuch was translated first, probably in Egypt, probably call it 250-ish, give or take, BC. But then other books started to be translated, the Psalms and Isaiah, and we don't know exactly the order, but it's going to be kind of the Psalms and the prophets, and it kind of goes from there. And it's a long period of time. It takes hundreds of years for all of them to be translated. It's not like one committee and they press print and all of a sudden you have a Septuagint. That's not how it played out. So that's one of the issues. And so it's a
Yeah.
long process. I mean,
Right.
it could have been 300 plus years to do from start to finish from Genesis. A lot of folks would argue the last one to be translated was probably like Song of Solomon or maybe
Mm.
Ecclesiastes. We don't know for sure, but it's probably one of those. So it's a long period of time. It's not a single group. It's a bunch of disparate groups. Most of them may have been in Egypt, but we're not 100% sure on that. So it's not a singular editorial committee. And then the problem with it, the biggest problem is, pretty much right away, and this is true for modern English translations or Spanish or whatever. It's pretty much as soon as they start distributing these, you have scribes who are copying them and they're making mistakes. So you start to have textual variants,
Mm-hmm.
and you have people who start to redo the translation. Like, oh, I don't like that. Let's change it. You already see evidence for this even in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now it reaches its apex with the three, Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion. That's part of Origen's Hexapla, but it was already
You
happening.
made a video about it recently, a
I
couple of
did,
days
yeah.
ago.
And so people are already making tweaks to the translation. And so which one of those is the Septuagint? That's the issue. It's like, is it the original copy that we no longer have? Is it the edited version? Is it the scribal variant from this one? Is it Aquila? Whatever. So it becomes enormously complicated. And in fact, some of the books don't even have one textual form. They have two that are distinct enough that you can't really treat them as the same. So Daniel has that issue. Judges, to a certain degree, has that issue. Portions of other books have that issue. You have kind of two different versions of Jeremiah. You got the Hebrew and the Greek version. So it just becomes enormously complicated. So we wanted in the book to always put Septuagint in quotations because it's still a useful label. I don't think we can scrap it, but we just have to be aware that it refers to more kind of a fuzzy group of text as opposed to one single book that you could have bought on ancient Amazon, in 100 BC. That's not a thing that existed. You can do it today. When you go to Amazon, you should buy the Septuagint Reader's Edition, which Will and I edited. That's the one you should buy. Because my kids need to eat, but that's not really historically how it would have worked. So it's just a problematic term. But as long as you're aware that it's a bit of a moving target, it's fine. I still say Septuagint,
Right.
but it has like an asterisk beside it. It's too much of a mouthful to do it right. So we still use it as a shorthand, but it's a shorthand for think of it more like a river. It's not like just one can of water. It's a
Right.
river that was changing over time. As long as you understand it that way, you'll be safe.
Right. Because in the circle of discussion that we have oftentimes with people, they kind of just push the idea that it's like this monolithic completed text that's been there, right? 200
Right.
years before Christ. This is what the apostles used, and this is what Jesus read.
Right.
We
And you're
always
like,
get this into this
sometimes
polemical.
maybe in certain situations, possibly.
Right.
That's what I would say.
Yeah, exactly. But I would say, should I say oversimplification, exaggeration to a certain extent? And then when we try to point out the nuances, just thankful to your books like you, and also what you have written and the points, they just get thrown off. Like it's like, oh, that's not true. That's the Protestant scholars they're saying this. They always
Right.
cast the shadow of doubt on the Septuagint. So
Yeah. And so, it's funny. I think it's really similar to that kind of binary that I was talking about earlier.
right,
I think folks have a desire for things to be really clear cut and simple, and that's
right,
not wrong. But I
okay,
think with something as complicated as Septuagint, you do end up in kind of a weird place if you do that. If you are
mm,
prone to, but if you're prone to oversimplifying things, you're just going to make the wrong conclusions. I'm like, the better option is to leave it complex, do your homework, and be okay with some of the ambiguity.
right,
It's not bad. So
sure,
so in this book, not to keep going back to this book, but uh, one of the essays that I found most, I think, refreshing was by a colleague of mine up in Washington, D.C., named Tommy Keene. He did the New Testament chapter. And his conclusion probably would be surprising to some, but his conclusion, take it or leave it, was that the apostles and Jesus, when they're quoting the Old Testament, they didn't seem to be all that concerned with which version they were quoting. And when you think about it technologically, they couldn't be all that concerned. They didn't have Blue Letter Bible. They didn't have Bible Gateway.
Yeah.
They didn't have a repository to say, what does it say in Caesarea? And which does yours say? And at best, they had whatever was at their disposal in Antioch or Rome. It's like, well, this is the one we have. And so they would go with that. And sometimes it would be Hebrew. Sometimes it might be Greek. They're obviously putting it all in Greek. So I thought that was actually quite refreshing to be like, hey, everyone relax a little bit. This is partly an anachronistic conversation that we're having.
Right.
In terms of, did they, privilege the Hebrew or the Greek? And was it the Septuagint or not? It's like, well, the answer is kind of yes. Actually, sometimes they just do whatever they need to do wherever they are, and God is guiding that process. There wasn't one sacrosanct textual tradition, because if there were, then we certainly wouldn't have that would not very well explain the data that we do have. What we have is really a mixed bag, and like I'm fine with that. That's exactly how I would have expected it to work out.
Yes.
In that time and place. So I think that essay sort of helped. Hopefully, for some at least. Look, this is not the Protestants trying to do something weird, or Roman. This is not a Roman Catholic Protestant thing, whatever. This is just the data that we have that we're trying to explain. They might look at us funny and be like, why are y'all debating this? Like, this is not at all what we were doing. We were just trying to use the Bible as we had it. Pre-Google. So
sure. And it's also just to clear up some air, because the other day I brought up the example when some kind of general claim was made that it's the Bible, Jesus, and then I came out and pointed at the example of in whom there appears. Is like, okay, let me look this up further. And I said, look, I'm not advocating, the particular family text or textual tradition. Just saying the New Testament authors, picked up whatever that's available for them at that point of time, right? Like there's no preferred prioritized reading. We see
at
this.
least it doesn't seem to be the case when you actually look at what they're doing.
Yeah.
So take an example, like so in the Gospels, this I think helps kind of prove the point. So in the Gospels, Jesus will quote from Genesis 2 when he's discussing marriage. And now in English, it might seem like the quoted form, the wording is basically the same. But if you look it up in Greek and compare them, all of them are different. Now, are they massively different? No, but the verbs are slightly different. Some have the compound prefix, some don't. The word order is not the same. And then you look it up in the Septuagint, and it's not the same. And you look it up in the Hebrew, and it's slightly different. So you have like 5 different options.
Right.
And so you're like, well, so you could say, oh, a massive contradiction. You could say that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as they're recording the words of Jesus, he cites Genesis 2. A man shall leave his, family, cling to his wife. And they cite it in a form that they knew. And it's not always the same, but they're getting the essence of what he's saying. And it's like, it's fine. Like, go outside and like go for a walk now. Like, it's going to be okay.
It's not word for word. It doesn't have to be word for word. That's our imposition of the worldview, like the one that we have sort of quote unquote created and imposed on how they view it, right?
Yeah. And they're all inspired.
Yes.
And so it appears that the Holy Spirit was comfortable guiding Matthew, Mark, and Luke to cite the same passage and say, this is the word of Jesus, and it doesn't match. Yes. And I'm like, that's actually okay. That's how
if Jesus said it, that's fine with me.
Writing worked.
Yeah.
They couldn't text each other and be like, hey, what did you say whenever you quoted Jesus this way? Because he probably did it in Hebrew or Aramaic anyways. And
exactly. True.
Yeah. So
that's a good point. I mean, like the original form of like the language of communication would have been Aramaic or Hebrew at that time, right? So
interesting. I do think it's a whole different conversation. I do think Jesus did teach at times in Greek.
Yes,
But
yes, that's
we do
understandable.
know for sure that's harder to prove, but we do know he taught in Aramaic because you get elements of that in the Gospels. So
Oh yeah, yeah. Sometimes it's like it says Talita kum. I mean, he said
right,
this in Arabic and so forth. Yeah.
yeah,
Just a continuation of on this is that how then does the Eastern Orthodox Christians, like Eastern Orthodox Church, makes the claim that is this one Septuagint is the Apostles' Bible? It's like since we have kind of scattered texts and the completion
yeah.
of so-called this canon comes up
That's
later
a
time,
it's a
based
really
on what?
interesting question,
Yeah.
and it's not one that a lot of Greek Orthodox scholars, at least that I've read, and there's been
Mm-hmm.
some journal articles about how the Orthodox movement view the Hebrew. But if you look at, as an example, the kind of main Orthodox Bible, that's the English version for like English speaking Orthodox people, they'll
Mm.
say, and I looked it up, I quote it in some of my books. They'll say, okay, that we believe the sacred scriptures of the Old Covenant or the New, however they say it, or the Old Testament is found in the Septuagint, and that includes the extra books. That's a whole different conversation in terms of the Deuterocanon for them. But they actually, at least nothing that I've read, I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I haven't read everything, but in what I've studied, they never say what the text is they're using. As best I can tell, I think they lean on Alexandrinus
Mm.
because that explains mostly the books that they include in terms
Mm-hmm.
of the broader canon, and it would more or less explain the text of those books.
Mm.
I don't think they're using Vaticanus.
Right.
Vaticanus doesn't include some of the books that they use, and I mean, it's
Yeah.
possible that they're using some sort of influence of Sinaiticus, but those are the big three. There are obviously other manuscripts, but it feels to me like Alexandrinus, as far as I can tell, has pole position, like the primary position for them. But I'm not aware that it ever gets, I mean, at least not like the websites I've looked at and the articles I've read. I'm not aware that they actually ever say
Mm.
what they call the Septuagint. They just say we use the Septuagint. I'm like, well, which one? They're not all identical.
Yeah.
Uh, it's like saying I use the English Bible. I'm like, well, which one? They're not the
Yes.
same.
Right.
I mean, they're essentially the same in sort of doctrine and so forth, but like the wording ain't the same. So I don't know. I don't know how they grapple with it. It almost seems like they don't. Um, and then they're
Interesting.
still kind
Yeah.
of
You
there's been
made
a
a
lot of
note as well.
modern Greek Orthodox, at least on the scholarly front, not so much in the
Okay.
church.
Right.
There's more interest in terms of like how do we approach the Hebrew. So there's been some work on that, but I've rarely, if ever, seen anyone say, "Here's what we mean by quote unquote the Septuagint. We mean Codex Alexandrinus, or we mean Rolf's Honhart, or we mean some minuscule from Constantinople." Like I don't think they ever say. I would
Mm.
love to find out if they do, um, but I haven't at least seen it in print. Anyway,
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for covering that as well. And I think as we move on, is that just from that Septuagint, there's another aspect of the study of the ancient texts is the myths and mistakes, particularly in textual criticism, you contributed in this book as well. In chapter 6, dating myths, right? How
Mhm.
later manuscripts can be better manuscripts. Um, you say that sometimes later manuscripts are better manuscripts, though not always. To begin, we must clarify what it means to be better. So the question is then, how can later manuscripts contain earlier text and often high quality text if they are far so removed from the earliest sources? I mean, I know it's a bit dense,
Sure, yeah,
but yeah. So go ahead and help us to understand, because again, there's also two spectrum, like two approaches. It's like we have seen scholars always say, the earlier we get, the earlier the manuscript is, that's the far more accurate reading. So they will push away the later manuscript. So you are kind of actually proposing a different way to see it. Please share your thoughts on this.
right. And there's the companion chapter to that one, which is earlier is not always better, right? So my chapter was later is not always worse. That was kind of the running subtitle. They tweaked it at the end. And
Right.
then there's a chapter which is earlier is not always better. And it is specifically to address again, this mistake that we think people can make, which is an assumption that early manuscripts, papyri and so forth, they're better because they're closer to the point of origin. And then the farther out you get, 900s, thousands, 1200, whatever, they're going to get worse. And that's under the assumption that the closer you are to the copying, the start of the copying, the more accurate you'll be. And the more time that passes, the worse it'll be. And so we're trying to clarify that neither one of those assumptions are necessarily true. And so the earlier is not always better idea is, look, scribes can make mistakes anytime. Just because you happen to live in 175 AD and you're 100 years removed from the writing of whatever, that doesn't mean you're necessarily good.
Oh,
really bad scribe. And so just because it's an early copy doesn't mean it's a superior copy.
how did they even? I didn't even think about this example. Yeah, this
Yeah.
logic basically. Yeah, go on.
I mean, early manuscripts are helpful because they take us farther back, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always right. On the flip side, you can have a manuscript from 1500 AD that is copied from a manuscript from 400 AD. And we can actually prove that kind of scenario. Because some of the scribes will actually comment, like, oh, I copied this from the ancient copy at Caesarea or whatever that Eusebius had, even though I'm like 1,000 years later or whatever. And so what matters is the quality of the text that you're copying from. And if that is a good copy, and you're a good scribe who is not prone to make a bunch of stupid mistakes, I'd probably make a lot of mistakes. I'm terrible at writing by hand. You can ask my Greek 1 students. It's bad. I can't write anything. But that's beside the point. I would have been a very bad scribe. I would have been one of those early scribes who was not very good. So you wouldn't have wanted to use mine. Anyway,
than that. Yeah.
What matters is the quality of the text you're copying from, which we call the exemplar, and the quality of your own copying. And so you can have a very good chain of copies that go back early, that were well preserved, and then you could have somebody copy from that stream in the 1500s, and it could be very good. Now, by contrast, you could have a situation where earlier they were doing pretty well, and then it kind of got worse over time, and things got wonky or whatever. You can have that too. So all I'm simply trying to argue, and I'm trying to use examples in that chapter to try to illustrate that sometimes later manuscripts, that is, copied in the Middle Ages or whatever, can be very, very good. And that's actually, I think that's good news. Well, part of what we're trying to do with this book is say, look, we are all young scholars who believe in the inspiration of Scripture. We believe that we have a reliable Bible. We just want to have better defense of that. We don't like bad arguments. That's the basic premise of the book. It's not like we don't have a big axe to grind. We're actually trying to say, look, we believe in the reliability of the New Testament. We just want to get better at making the argument for it. We don't want to use bad arguments. That's the idea behind the book. It's like, we don't help anyone if we try to overplay the evidence, if we try to spin it in a way that's inaccurate. That doesn't help anyone, because you can figure that out in 3 seconds on Wikipedia. So if we're going to make these arguments about dating of manuscripts and numbers of manuscripts and age of manuscripts and all that kind of stuff, we need to do it well, because bad arguments actually become counterproductive, especially these days with Muslim apologists, with kids who've read a book by Bart Ehrman and they're a freshman at whatever university. Like, they can spot that stuff a mile away. People respond to that very quickly on YouTube. There's been a lot of fact checking of some famous apologists in recent weeks, misstatements that are made on various podcasts and so forth. And what we're trying to say is, like, look, we don't have to overplay the data because we have this anxiety to prove the Bible. It's like, no, the Bible is what it is.
Yes.
Let's make good arguments.
The Bible has stood the test of time.
Yeah.
You just have to be truthful to the data of it. We don't have to manipulate it. I mean, this book was an eye opener as well. One of the obviously, I liked your chapter. I didn't really expect you to. First, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't really expect to speak to you one of the persons that I read in this book. So it's God's blessing. I really appreciate it and thank God for that. Second is that you really changed my assumption. I was like, because I have my own bias.
Right.
You follow certain scholars and they will say it's like, okay, this is what it is. And then when I read you, like you made sense. I totally understand. One of the examples that you gave is that it really makes sense. It really makes sense because why did I even assume that those who lived earlier centuries wouldn't make a mistake? Like I'm almost making them infallible.
I
It's
mean,
like how
it's because very popular, well-meaning, and
right,
guys that I've been blessed by, who do
right.
apologetics, that's the kind of way they've been spinning the data, and
Spinning the wheel.
it's just not correct. I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's partly correct, or
Yes.
it's sometimes correct, and the problem
Correct.
is you take something that's sometimes correct and you try to apply it to everything because it makes Christianity seem more plausible, more defensible, then you run into issues.
Yes. It's more of it provides a basis. I think a far more reasonable way to say is that okay, we have a basis. We have we have a justification to know what we know today, what we have today, but not absent in an absolute sense, right?
Yeah,
So just to as we are approaching the close of our the end of our discussion, if and I asked you about this earlier as well, in the same book there's a chapter that talks about the distribution of the manuscript. Like when we talk about broadly about manuscript, oh, we have 5,800 manuscripts, and we just throw it, and therefore that proves
no, thank
the New
you. Yeah,
Testament. We talk about then what I realize is that we're talking about the size of the manuscript, the content of the manuscript, the size, I mean the distribution of the manuscript, and all those things across first 1,000 years, millennium. I am particularly interested is the distribution of the copies of these writings, particularly in the New Testament. Seems the data seems to show that there's kind of a overplay, like there's more emphasis or more importance or priority given to certain category of writing. Say, for example, John's Gospel compared to Mark.
right.
Why is this in these early centuries as we move when we talk about textual criticism and scribe and the transmission of text? Could you
Right.
help us to shed some light on this?
Yeah, I mean, that the statement, we have 5,800 manuscripts in the New Testament, and that proves the New Testament or whatever. It's like, man, there's so many flaws in that statement, but we say it all the time. First, the number's probably not 5,800. The vast majority are not complete, and the fact that we have so many of them doesn't necessarily prove anything about Christianity and its truth claims. It just means that we have a lot of copies of the New Testament. Whether it's
Yes,
true or not, and whether these things actually happen, that's a totally different issue. Anyway,
true.
back to your specific question. Yeah, it's essentially true. If you just look at the Gospels and you look at the first, call it 300 or 400 years, it is definitely true that the frequency of survival, I'll put it that way, is it's not even. So we have a lot of copies of Matthew and John. We have comparatively few early copies of Mark, and we kind of have in the middle for Luke. So the question is why? And of course, we don't really know why. The reality, because what we don't know is how many of these copies of Matthew originally circulated. We only have the ones that survived.
Mm,
And I have to believe that in the first 400 years, like we have 3 papyri of Mark right now, one of which is the new one I mentioned earlier, Papyrus 137. Pretty sure, based on patristic usage and so forth, that if you look at like 400 AD, we would have had more than 3. Like, there's definitely more than 3 copies of Mark running around.
mm.
It's just most of them didn't survive.
Right,
Why?
right.
I don't know. Maybe they were in a place where the library caught on fire. Maybe there was a war and somebody burned it. Who knows? I mean, I've lost books. I don't know where they are. So, in one sense, it's not even worth losing a lot of sleep over because survival of ancient artifacts, like we talked about earlier, is kind of arbitrary.
Mm,
And almost all these come from Egypt. Well, obviously, there's Christians everywhere at this point in time. by the 400s. It's just in Egypt, things tended to survive better than elsewhere. So I want to be careful not to assume that the number of surviving artifacts has any bearing whatsoever on really anything about the relative importance of any of these writings.
Right.
That being said, I still think you could, again, with a lot of caveats, make the case that Matthew and John were more popular, at least for the first couple of 100 years. And when you look at Mark, you could kind of understand why. Now, I'm not bashing Mark. I love Mark. But like if you're a church with limited resources and you're like, hey, there's these new gospel things that are pretty sick. They're about Jesus. Let's get some copies and let's read them. And you get Matthew and then you get Mark and you're like, okay, well, Mark is like almost all the stuff that's in, like everything in Mark with like 3 exceptions is already in Matthew. But Matthew also has a birth narrative. It has the Sermon on the Mount. It has the church discourse. It has a longer Olivet discourse, and it has a full chapter of the resurrection appearances of Jesus. All right, so let's pick that one. Like, let's keep that one. And maybe Mark we can send to Goodwill. I don't know if you have Goodwill where you are. Goodwill is like a secondhand shop, and let's pass that one on to our friends down the street. Like that's kind of a ridiculous hypothetical, but that could explain why Mark doesn't maybe get copied as much. Is that it's like if you have Matthew, you kind of have the essence of what is in Mark. So that could explain it. Luke, hypothetically, I mean, we have a lot of manuscripts of Luke too, but it's not as much as Matthew and John. The big sort of X mark against Luke is that he wasn't an apostle. So you could see a case, especially in the early years, where like, well, Matthew and John were apostles, Luke's not. I don't know. I'm just hypothesizing here, but these are the different kind of ideas that have been thrown around as to try to explain the different distribution.
But the rationale is I would say it's reasonable.
Yeah.
When you made a comparison with Mark and Matthew,
we could have had thousands of copies of Mark. They just mostly didn't survive. Like we just simply don't know what existed in the churches at that point in time. All we have are what happened to survive. And then once you get to 5th century, 6th century, where the Gospels are all pretty much always traveling together as opposed to individually, then it's not even an issue. Like they just are. And the other thing to point out, actually, I'll mention this too. With the exception of Papyrus 66 of John, and I guess I would include Papyrus 75 of Luke and John, and then Papyrus 45, which is the earliest combo of all 4. Prior to those, and with those as the exceptions, all of these copies that we have that we're talking about, sort of early copies of Matthew, early copies of John, that people will sort of make these numerical claims about, they're all fragments. So it's a half of a quarter. It's like a quarter of a page of Matthew, like Papyrus 104. It's this big. That's it. Same thing. Papyrus 4 is just a little smidgen, and so forth. P112.
Right.
So here's the frustrating reality that we deal with. There is nothing that would have prevented Papyrus 104 from being a whole gospel codex. It could have had Mark in it. It could have had Luke in it. For all we know, it could have been Matthew and Mark. We don't know. All we have is a portion from one chapter of Matthew. It would have almost certainly been the entire book of Matthew, but it could have been 2 gospels. It could have also had Mark. It's just that got wasted away and eroded, and we don't have any more. So I guess I don't stress too much about the numerical distribution because we're lucky anything survived, frankly. I mean, that's a lot of folks don't realize that. It's like the fact that we have so many that
the ending.
Survived,
yeah.
I mean, praise God for that, because there's no reason they should have. Think about all the wars that have been fought in that neck of the woods for the past 800 years. Like it's a miracle that anything survived the Muslim conquest, honestly.
So there needs to be an exposure on that as well. I mean, like how this thing whole survived.
The frustrating thing is that we don't know, by definition, we don't know what we don't have. I know it's a double negative, but we have to be careful about making these kinds of numerical claims because we have
Right.
no idea how many copies of Mark there once were.
Right.
What we do have, and in fact, if you look at Mark's a good example of this, because of course the last few verses are famously debated in chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. The long ending, which is actually there's like 5 of them, different options. Some of the church fathers, like Eusebius, going back to him, they'll make a comment. Such and such a manuscript has these verses, but most of the ancient ones don't. Eusebius says that.
Mm.
I'm paraphrasing. And what he says, so he says, and he's 200s, 300s. He says most of the ancient copies of Mark don't have verses 9 through 20, but some do. And so you're like, okay, unless Eusebius is lying, so we have no reason to think he is on this point. Eusebius, I think, does a great job. He had access and awareness to a whole boatload of early copies of Mark. He doesn't
Right.
quantify it, but he says many. Actually, he says most. He's most of the ancient copies. Just none of them survived. So I don't know. What do we do with that? So it appears that Mark did have high circulation. It's just so far we haven't found the copies. Anyway, it's a complicated answer to a simple question.
But thank you so much. You provided some I would say some good analysis how we should see things, right? It's not really like a straight answer,
Yeah.
but how should we approach and see these things?
Yeah. I tell my students at RTS that at least in the classroom, I'm in the business of making things complicated.
No, so far you have been very exegetical. Like it's been expository style. That's why I like the combination of a pastor and also a scholar. It's like in the church setting is like, hey, help us to understand these things, right? And on the last question, which you were we were referring to, I read a hypothesis is just that it could be because of the preference of a particular community.
Maybe.
Say, for example, in the Ephesus, they preferred John, right, more.
Could be.
And Alexandria could be other things. And that's where the sort of Christological error actually kind of rose, how we view Jesus and sort of like these things. There are many way answers to this. There's no one straight answer to, as you mentioned, but appreciate you providing that analysis, right?
Yeah.
We've come to an end, and I really thank you so much for your time. Time really flies by when you talk to people like you, because it's, first of all, because as I mentioned again, time and again, I really take great interest. There was one final question from the audience. I don't know how would you answer this. He says that Zons is a brother, basically. He says, among the scholars, what's the general mix of denominations? I think referring to the particular study of ancient texts and biblical manuscripts, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestants.
If you focus on New Testament scholarship, on New Testament manuscripts, textual criticism, I'm not aware. I think there's a growing contingent of Roman Catholics involved. There are a few Greek Orthodox. Well, there's certainly a couple on the Septuagint side. I would say though it's mostly a Protestant-dominated field for whatever reason. And I would say within that, I think the Baptists have done a lot. The Baptists have been very involved in textual criticism. You've got Dallas Theological Seminary that's been big in it, New Orleans Theological Seminary, or New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, some places like that. And so they've probably had I don't know if it's a majority, but there's a lot of well-known textual critics and manuscript folks who happen to align Baptist of various stripes. Beyond that, I don't know. I mean, there's obviously a few Presbyterians like myself. I don't know how many like other denominations are in the game. It's not something that people track per se. So
I think my brother
it's not really all that
trying
relevant when it comes to this particular field.
Right.
Your persuasion on the sacraments or church polity is not really all that relevant. So that's actually one of the blessings of it. Textual criticism is a very fun place to be in a lot of respects, because basically everybody has an equal foot at the table, because we're dealing with concrete artifacts. There's a set of methodologies and so forth that we all share. and
Right.
we can differ on this or that variant and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the
Mm.
day, we're not like saying you can't be a member of my church if you don't do this or whatever. Like, well, okay, I guess some KJV onlyists do, but in general,
Mm.
it's a pretty equal playing field. Whereas
Right.
if you go to like Pauline scholarship, or if you want to study systematic theology, whatever, things are much more polarized there, where your
Mm.
denominational and theological affinities greatly influence what you're doing. That's really
Right.
not, I mean, I can't even imagine many scenarios where it would even be like the fact that I'm Presbyterian would make a difference in the blocking, like in the basics of like how to do textual criticism. Like it's just not all that relevant.
No, no,
Well, what
I think
happens
it's
to
more of a
baptized babies?
statistics.
That doesn't matter, right? Um,
Yeah, it's more of a thing from the statistical point of view.
Yeah,
He
I
was
don't
trying to
know.
get us
I really,
something.
I mean, I would say it's definitely been mostly, it's been dominated by Baptists for a long time. And I'm not saying that's
Mm.
a bad thing. It just is what it is. I appreciate those guys.
Yes, yes,
But
totally.
other than that, I wouldn't even know where to begin to quantify it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's. I mean, I appreciate you answering that. Just want to
Yeah.
throw it off. Just perhaps from statistics. I think, but generally, it's known from. I think even the Bible's produced study Bible from Orthodox Study Bible. I think it's from Thomas Nelson, the Catholic Study Bible, and all sorts of things. It's a growing thing because it's perceived as very Protestant to really spend a lot of time on the text.
Yeah, that's probably true.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so as a conclusion, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Greg. It was fun having you. We learned so much, and I think there's three channels that you associated: the
Yeah.
RTS.
A
So
year
for
ago,
the
I had
audience,
0. Now I have 3 somehow. I don't know what I've done with my
and the
life. It's
amount
been
of
fun. It's been
energy, that's
fun.
like I was thinking, it's like, okay, I gotta keep it up with Dr. Grego here because on my feed is like three affiliated channels coming up, and so the first one would be RTS Institute for the Study of the Ancient Texts,
And
Dr. Greg
that one is shared with, I have 4 other colleagues who,
contributors,
yeah,
right?
contribute and so forth.
The second one would be your personal channel, Dr. Greg Lanier. You have one
Yeah.
on your name. You contribute and talk about the same scope of the subject matter as well. And the third one
And
will be
some new,
daily
some
dose.
different stuff. So on that one, I'll be doing a lot of other kinds of things. So we just kind of kicked that off. But for example, I have a video coming up. I think it's tomorrow, but depends on when this is airing.
Right.
You know, it's addressing, does Matthew misapply Hosea 11? And so it's an interesting
Mm.
question that I
You
that I've
always want to maintain, like, you kind of have the distinction between these two
yeah.
channels.
So
I
that
mean,
one's
yeah,
not, that one doesn't, like, that's not an institute question because it's not about ancient manuscripts. That's more like a
right.
hermeneutical question. Then the
Yeah, I
third channel that
apologize.
you'll mention is the daily dose of Septuagint. So that's like the daily readings of the Septuagint. So
You got
they're
videos coming out every single day,
I d-
right? For 5 days,
6, yeah.
right?
It's a lot of
6 days, except the
6
Sabbath.
days a week on
So,
that one.
guys,
Yeah, it's a lot. I
tune
don't know
in,
what I've got
tune in.
myself into. But I
Yeah,
hope it's a blessing. I hope it's beneficial to people.
absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much. Despite you're a pastor, you're a church, you're your husband, your father. Wow, and I thank you for your work, and God bless you. Thank you for your the writings as well. Keep up the good work, and God bless you. Hope to
Thank you.
have you sometime again whenever you have
Yeah, appreciate your
availability.
time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And hope you have benefited from our guest, obviously. And do check out the books that he has written and the books that are cited. There was some one or two that was referenced in the chat. And wherever you are, God bless you, and have a nice day, evening, and night wherever you are. God
Take
bless.
care.